There is a mystery about prayer that many believers overlook. Many Christians pray every day. They speak words. They repeat requests. And yet they often feel as if heaven is silent. But when you study the life of Paul in the New Testament, you discover that he understood something deeper about prayer, something powerful, something transformative, something that turned ordinary conversations with God into moments that shook the spiritual world. Paul did not treat prayer as a ritual. He treated prayer as a living connection with God. And that is where the difference begins. Many believers approach prayer with the idea that it is mainly about asking God for things. They come to God with requests about their problems, their needs, their fears, and their desires. While there is nothing wrong with bringing needs before God, Paul understood that prayer was much deeper than simply asking for help. For him, prayer was about alignment. It was about bringing his heart, mind, and spirit into harmony with the will of God. When Paul prayed, he was not trying to persuade God to change his mind or convince him to act in a certain way. Paul knew that God already had a perfect plan. Instead of trying to bend God's will to match his own desires, Paul allowed prayer to reshape his desires so they would match the purpose of God. This is a powerful shift in perspective. It moves prayer from being a list of requests to being a place where transformation begins. If you study Paul's letters, you will notice something remarkable about the way he prayed for others. He did not focus primarily on material blessings or comfort. Instead, he prayed that believers would gain spiritual wisdom, deeper understanding, and stronger faith. In his letter to the church in Ephesus, Paul prayed that the eyes of their hearts would be opened so they could know the hope of God's calling and the greatness of his power. That kind of prayer shows that Paul's priority was not simply changing circumstances, but awakening spiritual vision. Paul realized that when a person's heart becomes aligned with God's purpose, everything else begins to fall into place. Circumstances may not immediately change, but the believer becomes stronger, wiser, and more prepared to walk through whatever lies ahead. Alignment with God gives clarity in confusion, courage in fear, and peace in uncertainty. Prayer for Paul was the place where this alignment happened. It was where he laid down his own expectations and opened his heart to God's direction. When believers truly pray this way, something begins to shift inside them. Their focus moves away from temporary struggles and toward eternal purpose. The heart begins to seek what God desires rather than simply what feels comfortable or easy. Paul's life itself is a clear example of this truth. After his encounter with Jesus, Paul's entire direction changed. He went from persecuting believers to becoming one of the greatest messengers of the gospel. This transformation did not happen simply because Paul decided to change his path. It happened because his life became aligned with the will of God. Prayer played a central role in maintaining that alignment throughout his ministry. Despite the many hardships Paul faced, imprisonment, persecution, rejection, and suffering, he remained focused on God's purpose. This kind of endurance does not come from human strength alone. It comes from a heart that has been shaped through prayer. When Paul prayed, he continually surrendered his plans and trusted God's greater design. This is where many Christians struggle. People often approach prayer hoping that God will remove difficulties or quickly solve their problems. When the answer does not come the way they expect, they may become discouraged. But Paul understood that prayer was not about escaping challenges. It was about becoming aligned with God's plan, even in the middle of those challenges. When believers begin to pray with this mindset, prayer becomes a powerful tool for spiritual growth. Instead of asking only for change in circumstances, they begin to ask for wisdom, strength, and understanding. They begin to ask God to guide their steps and shape their hearts. Over time, their perspective begins to change. Problems that once seemed overwhelming begin to look different because they are now viewed through the lens of God's purpose. Alignment with God also brings a deep sense of peace. When a person knows they are walking in God's will, they gain confidence even when life becomes difficult. Paul demonstrated this peace many times. Even while in prison, he continued encouraging others, writing letters filled with faith and hope. His confidence did not depend on his surroundings. It came from knowing that his life was aligned with God's mission. Prayer, therefore, becomes more than a moment of speaking words. It becomes a process of surrender, listening, and transformation. It becomes the place where believers step away from their own limited understanding and allow God to shape their direction. Through prayer, the heart becomes sensitive to God's voice and open to His guidance. This is the deeper truth Paul understood. Prayer was not a tool to control God. It was a doorway into partnership with Him. It was the place where human will and divine purpose met. When a believer learns to pray in this way, their relationship with God becomes stronger, their faith becomes steadier, and their life begins to reflect the greater plan that God has prepared for them. Many people approach prayer with the expectation that their circumstances will change immediately. When a problem appears, the first instinct is to ask God to remove it as quickly as possible. While God certainly hears and answers prayers, Paul understood something deeper about the process of prayer. He knew that before situations change on the outside, something powerful begins to change on the inside of the person who is praying. Prayer transforms the heart, the mind, and the spirit long before it transforms the circumstances. Paul's life clearly shows this truth. He faced hardships that would cause many people to lose hope. He was rejected by communities, beaten for his faith, imprisoned multiple times, and constantly threatened by those who opposed the message he carried. Yet, when we read the letters he wrote during these difficult moments, we do not find bitterness or defeat. Instead, we see strength, encouragement, wisdom, and deep confidence in God. This kind of mindset does not appear suddenly. It is formed through time spent with God in prayer. When Paul prayed, he allowed God to shape his inner life. Prayer became the place where fear was replaced with courage and doubt was replaced with faith. The problems around him did not always disappear, but his perspective toward those problems changed. He began to see trials not as obstacles that would destroy him, but as opportunities for God to work through him. This is an important lesson many believers miss. Prayer is not only about asking God to fix what is broken in life. It is also about allowing God to fix what is weak within us. Sometimes the greatest answer to prayer is not the removal of a challenge, but the transformation of the person who is facing it. Paul understood that God often uses pressure to strengthen faith. In his writings, he spoke about perseverance, endurance, and spiritual maturity. These qualities are not developed in comfortable moments. They are formed when a believer remains connected to God, even while walking through difficulties. Prayer keeps that connection strong. Through prayer, Paul's trust in God deepened. Each time he turned to God in the middle of suffering, his confidence in God's presence grew stronger. Instead of being controlled by his circumstances, Paul learned to stand firm in faith regardless of what was happening around him. Prayer became the source of that stability. Another powerful transformation that happens through prayer is the renewal of the mind. Human thinking often becomes clouded by fear, anxiety, and frustration when life becomes difficult. Without spiritual renewal, these emotions can take control of a person's thoughts. Paul understood that prayer helps clear the mind and refocus it on God's truth. When someone spends time in prayer, they begin to remember who God is and what He is capable of doing. They begin to reflect on God's promises and His faithfulness in the past. This reflection strengthens faith and brings peace even when circumstances remain uncertain. Paul demonstrated this renewed mindset many times, even while in prison. He wrote messages filled with encouragement to other believers. Instead of focusing on his chains, he focused on God's mission. Instead of complaining about injustice, he spoke about hope and joy. That kind of outlook comes from a heart that has been strengthened in prayer. Prayer also builds spiritual endurance. Life is full of seasons where answers take time and breakthroughs do not happen immediately. Without endurance, many people give up too soon. But Paul learned to remain faithful through long seasons of waiting and struggle. His strength came from the time he spent in the presence of God. In prayer, believers receive the spiritual strength needed to continue moving forward. God renews energy, restores hope, and reminds the heart that every challenge has purpose. Even when the path is difficult, prayer helps the believer keep walking with confidence. Another way prayer transforms the person praying is by softening the heart. When people face pain or injustice, it is easy for bitterness to grow. Anger and resentment can quietly take root inside the heart. But prayer allows God to remove those harmful emotions and replace them with forgiveness, patience, and love. Paul faced many situations where he could have become bitter toward those who harmed him. Instead, he continued to speak about grace and compassion. His heart remained focused on God's mission rather than personal revenge. This kind of spiritual maturity grows through consistent prayer and surrender. As a person continues to pray over time, they begin to notice that their reactions to life's challenges are different. Situations that once created panic now produce calm. Problems that once caused discouragement now create determination. The inner life becomes stronger, steadier, and more grounded in faith. This is why Paul valued prayer so deeply. He knew that true change begins within the heart. Circumstances may eventually shift, but the most important transformation happens when God reshapes the character, mindset, and spirit of the believer. Prayer becomes the place where that transformation unfolds, quietly building the strength needed to face every challenge with faith and confidence. One of the most powerful truths Paul understood about prayer is that believers are not alone when they pray. Many people think of prayer as something that depends entirely on their own words, their own focus, and their own ability to express what they feel. When they struggle to find the right words or feel spiritually weak, they begin to think their prayers are ineffective. Paul revealed something very different. He taught that prayer is not carried by human strength alone, but by the power and help of the Spirit of God. Paul explained that human beings often do not fully understand what they truly need or how to pray about certain situations. Life can become confusing, emotions can become overwhelming, and the mind can become filled with uncertainty. In those moments, a person may feel unsure about what to say to God. Instead of seeing this weakness as a failure, Paul showed that it is actually where the Spirit begins to work in a deeper way. In his teaching, Paul explained that the Spirit helps believers in their weakness. When words fail, and when understanding seems limited, the Spirit of God intercedes on behalf of the believer. This means that prayer is not only the voice of a human reaching toward heaven, it is also the Spirit of God moving within the heart, guiding the prayer in the direction of God's will. This idea changes the entire way a person views prayer. Instead of feeling pressure to pray perfectly, believers can approach God with humility and trust. They can know that even when they do not fully understand their situation, the Spirit understands completely. God is not listening only to the spoken words. He is also listening to the deeper desires and needs of the heart. Paul understood that the Spirit creates a connection between the believer and God that goes beyond human language. Sometimes prayer becomes a quiet moment of surrender where the heart simply rests in God's presence. In that stillness, the Spirit continues to work, shaping the prayer in ways that the human mind cannot fully comprehend. This partnership between the believer and the Spirit gives prayer incredible power. When prayer is guided by the Spirit, it moves beyond personal wishes and aligns with the purposes of God. The Spirit helps direct the focus of the prayer toward what truly matters in God's plan. Instead of praying from a limited perspective, believers begin to pray in a way that reflects the greater vision of God's kingdom. Paul's life reflected this deep connection with the Spirit. Throughout his ministry, he relied on spiritual guidance rather than personal strategy alone. There were moments when the Spirit led him to travel to certain places and moments when the Spirit prevented him from going in other directions. This sensitivity to God's guidance grew from a life that was continually connected to the Spirit through prayer. Prayer, therefore, became more than communication for Paul. It became a spiritual channel through which God's power and direction flowed. As Paul remained open to the Spirit's guidance, his ministry became effective and impactful even in difficult circumstances. The strength that carried him through challenges was not only his determination, but also the Spirit working within him. Another powerful aspect of this truth is that the Spirit strengthens believers while they pray. Life often places people in situations where they feel emotionally or spiritually drained. Fear, disappointment, and uncertainty can make a person feel weak. During these moments, prayer becomes a place where the Spirit renews strength. When a believer enters prayer with honesty and openness, the Spirit begins to restore what has been worn down by life's pressures. Peace replaces anxiety, hope replaces discouragement, and faith begins to grow again. The person may not always understand how the change happens, but they begin to feel a renewed sense of confidence and calm. Paul repeatedly encouraged believers to live by the Spirit and remain connected to God's presence. Prayer was one of the primary ways this connection was maintained. It allowed believers to stay sensitive to God's guidance and open to His strength. Another important truth Paul understood is that prayer, guided by the Spirit, produces unity between the believer's heart and God's will. Human desires can sometimes lead people in directions that are not beneficial or aligned with God's greater plan. But when the Spirit is actively involved in prayer, those desires begin to shift. The believer gradually begins to want what God wants and to pursue what God values. This transformation creates a deeper level of trust between the believer and God. Instead of feeling uncertain about whether their prayers are correct, the believer rests in the assurance that the Spirit is helping shape those prayers according to God's perfect wisdom. Over time, this partnership with the Spirit makes prayer feel less like a duty and more like a living relationship. The believer becomes aware that prayer is not simply a moment of speaking words, but an ongoing connection with God's presence. The Spirit continues to guide, strengthen, and intercede, turning prayer into a powerful experience where heaven and the human heart meet in unity. One of the deepest truths Paul understood about prayer is that it creates a personal and intimate relationship with God. Many people believe in God, attend church, and know religious teachings, yet they still feel distant from Him. Paul's life reveals that prayer is the bridge that moves faith from simple belief into a living, personal relationship with the Creator. For Paul, prayer was not just a duty or a spiritual routine. It was the place where he encountered God's presence and developed a deep connection with Him. When Paul spoke about his faith, he often expressed a powerful desire that went far beyond knowledge or religious activity. He wrote about his longing to truly know God. This desire shows that Paul's relationship with God was not based only on doctrine or teaching, but on personal experience. Prayer was the place where that experience developed and grew stronger. Many believers see prayer as a moment when they speak to God, but Paul treated prayer as a conversation and communion. It was not only about speaking, but also about being still in God's presence. Through these quiet moments, the heart becomes aware of God's closeness. The distractions of daily life fade away, and the believer begins to sense the peace and assurance that come from being near to God. Intimacy with God grows through time and consistency. Just like any meaningful relationship, closeness cannot develop if there is no regular communication. Paul spent time in prayer because he understood that the strength of his ministry and the stability of his faith depended on his connection with God. Without that connection, even the most dedicated believer can begin to feel spiritually empty. Paul faced enormous pressure throughout his life. He dealt with persecution, rejection, physical suffering, and constant opposition. Yet even in the middle of these challenges, he remained spiritually strong and focused on his mission. The reason for this strength was not simply his determination. It was the deep relationship he had developed with God through prayer. When someone spends time in prayer regularly, they begin to recognize God's presence in their life more clearly. The heart becomes sensitive to His guidance and comfort. This awareness changes the way a person experiences life. Difficult situations may still appear, but the believer no longer feels alone while facing them. Prayer also allows the believer to pour out their heart honestly before God. Paul understood that God welcomes sincerity. In prayer, a person can bring their fears, frustrations, hopes, and questions without pretending to be strong or perfect. This honesty strengthens the relationship between the believer and God. Instead of hiding weaknesses, the believer learns to trust God with every part of their life. As this trust grows, the relationship becomes deeper and more meaningful. Prayer stops feeling like a formal activity and begins to feel like spending time with someone who understands and cares deeply. The believer begins to sense God's love, guidance, and peace in ways that go beyond words. Another powerful result of intimacy with God is spiritual transformation. When a person regularly spends time in God's presence, their character begins to change. The qualities of love, patience, humility, and compassion start to grow naturally within the heart. This transformation does not come from human effort alone. It happens because the believer is continually influenced by the presence of God. Paul demonstrated this transformation in the way he treated others. Even when people rejected him or treated him unfairly, he continued to show grace and forgiveness. His actions reflected the character of Christ. This kind of behavior develops when a person is deeply connected to God through prayer. Intimacy with God also strengthens faith. When believers experience God's presence personally, their trust becomes stronger. Faith is no longer based only on what they have heard or read. It becomes rooted in their own encounters with God. They remember the peace they felt during prayer, the guidance they received, and the strength that came during difficult moments. Paul's letters often reflect this deep confidence in God. Even while facing danger or imprisonment, he spoke with peace and assurance. His words reveal a man who knew God personally, not just intellectually. That knowledge came from countless moments spent in prayer. As believers grow closer to God through prayer, their priorities begin to shift. Temporary concerns become less important compared to eternal purpose. The heart becomes more focused on God's will and the impact of His kingdom. This perspective gives life a deeper sense of meaning and direction. Prayer becomes the place where this intimacy continues to grow. In those quiet moments, the believer steps away from the noise of the world and enters into the presence of God. Over time, that presence becomes the most valuable part of their spiritual life, shaping their thoughts, strengthening their faith, and filling their heart with the peace that comes from truly knowing God. So the question is not simply whether we pray. The question is whether we pray the way Paul understood prayer. Do we come before God expecting transformation? Do we allow the Spirit to guide our prayers? Do we stay in His presence long enough for our hearts to change? Because when prayer becomes more than words, when it becomes communion with God, that is when lives begin to change, hearts begin to awaken, and faith begins to move mountains. Paul knew that secret, and when believers rediscover it, prayer will no longer feel powerless. It will become the most powerful force in their lives.